The subcommittee will come to order. We now welcome our third and final panel. Our witnesses are Ms. Elizabeth A. Field, Director, Defense Capabilities and Management for GAO, excuse me, and Mr. Pete Potochney, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment. The witnesses are here to provide an update on the Department of Defense's efforts to fully assess the extent and nature of the issues within the privatized military family housing program. In addition, they will provide details on their ongoing actions to remedy the inadequate oversight of the program and their long-term plan to make permanent positive changes to the program. Ms. Field, your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Thank you. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, members and staff of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on GAO's work assessing the Military Housing Privatization Initiative, or MHPI. Roughly 1 year ago, at the direction of this committee, we began our most recent review of MHPI. In our final report, which will be released later this month, we cite numerous ways in which those living in military privatized housing who experienced problems have felt that their concerns were ignored. These residents told us that they had to submit multiple requests before their issues were fixed, and that they felt they had no advocate or recourse if these problems weren't addressed. In some ways, these problems were perhaps predictable. As Comptroller General Dodaro testified last year, military privatized housing is a classic example in which the government made short-term decisions without thinking through the long-term implications. The idea behind MHPI, as you know, was to leverage private sector financing and expertise to eliminate poor quality housing for military families with less government funding and in less time than could have been done under the traditional military construction process. DOD entered into long-term agreements with the private companies. Both the government and the companies provided financing for each project, essentially forming public-private partnerships. GAO has studied these types of partnerships and determined that in structuring them, great care must be taken to protect the interests of both the federal government and the private sector. What we learned through our audit, however, is that while the MHPI partnerships may have been structured to sustain the financial health of the projects, there was less emphasis on ensuring that the private companies would be held accountable for the condition of the homes they own. For example, the metrics used in the agreements to monitor and incentivize the private companies' performance typically have had very housing offices were cut, and military housing officials on the ground didn't always fully exercise all of the authorities available to them. DOD is now taking several steps to rectify these problems. Our draft report also includes a number of recommendations which we hope DOD will concur with and implement as soon as possible. And of course, the fiscal year 2020 NDAA contains a number of additional requirements. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that implementing some of these steps may be difficult and may take time, in large part because of the complexities of the underlying agreements and the number of parties involved. As Comptroller General Dodaro has said, partnerships like MHPI should have a framework for making long-term decisions and trade-offs up front before we embark on these efforts. That did not necessarily happen in the case of MHPI. Now, DOD has an opportunity to consider how it wants the remainder of these long-term agreements to be handled so that everyone's interest is protected, including those of the service members and their families who live in these homes. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Field. Mr. Potochney, you're recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks, and your full statement will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Chairman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be here. By way of introduction, I am Pete Potochney, Acting Assistant Secretary for Sustainment. I'm filling that square since the end of November when Bob McMahon resigned. Seated behind me are my service colleagues, the Assistant Secretaries for Energy, Installations, and Environment in the Services, who have cognizance over our housing, Alex Beeler, Lucia Niemeyer, and John Henderson right there. While it's an honor to be here, the fact that this hearing and others like it are necessary is saddening. I do appreciate, though, the oversight that you're providing today and in the past and in the future, I'm sure. Providing quality housing to our families and members, places where they want and choose to live, is our highest priority. But we simply took our eye off the ball, but this isn't the first time. Congress authorized housing privatization in 1996. Then we had a $20 billion maintenance backlog. 70% of our houses were inadequate by the service's own standards individually. And recapitalization at that rate was insufficient to prevent further degradation. We asked Congress to authorize privatization, and the program was, by all accounts, a success for 20 years. We gained $32 billion in investment with only $4 billion, with only a $4 billion contribution on our part, and our housing dramatically improved. Privatization was, and I believe remains, the right thing to do. But our success allowed us to start focusing on other mission areas. Personnel were cut, training eliminated. To be sure, our housing is in much better condition now than it was previously, but we obviously have much more to do to get us out of where we are right now. It's important to note, we no longer own these houses. That's the definition of privatization, and that allows us to tap private sector capital, the capital that we didn't have ourselves to put in when we were in that backlog. So that's the struggle that we have right now. But I will, and they're not contracts, as many people say. These are ground leases generally. These deals are structured differently. The services took advantage of the authorities they have to structure them what made the most sense for them in their mission areas and frankly, their geography. So we do have authorities, and we're using them as they go forward. I'd argue that it's sad that we have to, again, have hearings like this, but we are getting better, and I believe that's true. And I hope you'll see it. So what are we doing now? We have, and you're hearing that we're improving communications, our transparency. We're instituting hotlines, using town halls. We're adding personnel, hundreds literally. We've published our Bill of Rights and our tenant responsibility documents. We still have a few provisions in the Bill of Rights to go. The Secretary felt we didn't have the unilateral authority to deal with 3 of those, as you've heard ad nauseum today, but we will be working through those, and you heard our privatization project owners or landlords sign up to that. We are improving our inspections, and the NDAA gave us some authorities there. Our medical personnel are tracking issues related to lead and mold and the like. Mold, for instance, is an interesting issue, significant, severe, no national standards. We're wrestling with that as well. We are providing tracking systems for our work orders, or at least our partners are, our landlords. We're standardizing and improving our survey processes so that we have data-driven oversight, which my colleague in the GAO has spent a lot of good time on, and we value what her report says, and I mean that sincerely. And of at least equal importance, and I would argue perhaps of most importance, we're focusing the leadership, the attention of our landlords, our installation commanders and their housing offices, as well as our units to assist the residents in these houses ensure or achieve the rights that they have. Finally, one last thing. We went after privatization and are maintaining privatization to obtain quality housing for our people. But that's quality housing over the long term. So the financial viabilities of these deals has to be maintained. Otherwise, our landlords can't maintain houses to the standards that we want. So those are the 2 issues that we're struggling with, is ensuring that they deliver what they're getting paid for, frankly, through the rent that our members pay, but also making sure that those deals remain solvent for the long term. So thank you once again, and I do appreciate this committee's oversight.
Thank you, Mr. Potochney. I have a lot of questions, but I will try to be succinct. It's my impression that the department is woefully undermanned to provide effective oversight of privatized military housing. You alluded to that. Do you agree with that assessment?
And we are adding hundreds of people, yes.
Okay. And so you referenced that you're increasing personnel in offices, I assume, that are charged with oversight of the housing program?
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Are there barriers to addressing that issue that Congress can be helpful with in terms of legislative authority or funding? We gave you $140 million last year for privatization support costs and management costs. What are you doing with those resources?
So, ma'am, I think we're spending money on hiring people. I think that, you know, we can talk about data and we can talk about leadership and oversight, and you heard both today, right? You know, I recognize that we need work to do on our surveys, for instance, and GAO has eloquently pointed that out. But the stories that you heard earlier today from residents, you don't really need data to figure out that there's a problem there, okay? And so that's where I'm coming from, is the leadership that we kind of got away from, we need to re-exercise, re-execute. And it's that attention that we have to do. And that's what I'm here to tell you that we're trying to do, and the people behind me as well.
Good, I certainly hope so. DOD has provided periodic reports to Congress on the privatized housing program, but the reported results on resident satisfaction really have been misleading or unreliable. Ms. Field referenced that because there are issues in the military department's collection of the data and in OSD's calculation and explanation of the data. So how are we supposed to be able to evaluate and make decisions on the MHPI program with faulty data? And we have to be able to trust the information that you're giving us, or why would we have you report?
Fair question. We've got a lot to do on data. In my view, at least.
But was it fudged?
No.
What was it? There's really smart people at DOD. It is really difficult for me to absorb that. Data is data. And I know it can be interpreted any way that somebody chooses to serve their interests. And I am not suggesting that the DOD or the military leadership had anyone else's interests in mind other than military families, but it is hard to understand how we could have not gotten accurate evaluation of data and misinformation.
Once again, ma'am, fair question. But what I'd argue is, we sure as hell didn't do a great job, and we're trying to do better, and I'm the first one to admit that. But were we managing these projects with that data, or were we allowing our privatization landlords, our project owners, to manage their projects as they see fit, since they own those houses? Mm-hmm. So we weren't using data to manage with. We're starting to collect it now, and frankly, we got off to a pretty rocky start, at least in my view, and I think your comments underscore the fact that you and others in the GAO feel the same way. But we weren't managing with that data originally. We were looking at the whole privatization approach was to provide this housing through the private sector, because that's what they do for a living, not us. We're not the Department of Housing. Mm-hmm. So we and it frankly worked for quite a while. We kind of got off, we took our eyes off that bubble. We worried about other mission things and functions. We're back there now. But to answer your question directly is we weren't managing with that data, but we were going to start.
Make no mistake, they took their eye off the ball too, and I asked them a question about how they could have gotten their job so wrong.
Yes, ma'am, I think that's fair.
Is the Office of the Secretary of Defense providing policy guidance or proposed changes? It was the previous panel of private companies, one of them in particular, mentioned the BAH and the need for potential increase in the BAH, really specifically related to the variation in housing. He didn't mention this, but I want to ask you about the variation in housing costs by location. We as members of Congress, depending on where we live and the district that we represent, the cost of living is higher. So some of us get a little bit higher MRA than other members do to account for those costs. In regions where housing costs are high, the BAH for junior service members doesn't seem to be sufficient to afford their housing. That makes no sense. Is there any effort or thought process to considering whether there is a location factor in the BAH?
So, ma'am, our BAH is dependent upon surveys that are conducted locally. All right. So we peg our
surveys that ask what?
Oh, so I don't not my responsibility. It's in personnel and readiness, but I understand a fair amount about it. Is they will survey a local area for housing that is available to our members, suitable housing, and they essentially average the cost of that, and that's what determines BAH rates, basic allowance for housing rates.
Okay. I would really suggest that, given that it's not in your job description.
Well, no, we have to pick up the pieces for it. Excuse me. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
I think really it has to go back, and you have to go back and look at how you are calculating it, because, as we've referenced to private all the way through this hearing, on a private salary in a more expensive location without the proper evaluation of what true housing costs are in a community, and a BAH to match, then it's really unfair, because they have to pay the rent regardless, and then they don't necessarily have the resources to do that.
Okay, so
and then the companies also don't have the resources to make sure that in the private market, they can generate enough capital.
Right. So so a couple of things in that regard. One is I think our surveys are pretty good for assessing what the cost of housing is in a local community. By the way, only 30% of our people are in privatized housing. 70% of our families are out in town. Right. So they're absolutely dependent on basic allowance for housing. But the other piece, and what I heard listening to the earlier panels on TV, is the fluctuation in the borrow rate, and that makes it difficult because, again, the foundation of housing privatization was the access to private sector capital. And so if borrow rates are fluctuating, then it makes it more difficult to project what their income stream is based on. And so that's what I thought I heard today, and I think that absolutely does bear scrutiny. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. Judge Carter?
When this all started, I thought the soldier owned the house. He doesn't, does he?
No, sir.
So it's just
It's a rental unit.
big rental project.
Yes, sir.
Is there an insurance? Is there some kind of insurance to cover homeowners?
Well, as I understand it, the tenants can take out renter's insurance, and then the partners have their own insurance as well.
But they do have insurance to cover this.
I believe, yeah.
Did y'all build into your contract any penalties for failing to manage appropriately?
So we have incentives to manage appropriately, and incentives that you
That's
don't.
more money. And if they don't, if you're getting bad reports that don't look like make it look like they're doing a good job, and they're putting the data in the reports, then they're getting a raise when they ought to probably be getting a cut.
Right. Yes, sir. That could be. I think that the intent originally was to have these houses be competitive with the outside. So members would we were hoping members would want to live and choose to live on base. But if they chose not to, then they had the option of going off base, and they absolutely still do that. But there is frankly a special category. We're not the subject of this hearing isn't the housing out in town. It's the housing that we have on our base.
Yeah, that's right.
So it is essentially it's a third class of housing. We have government-owned housing, primarily now overseas, military housing privatization initiative housing, which is what we're talking about, and then plain old housing out in town.
Thank you.
Mr. Case?
Thank you. Were you able to listen to the prior testimonies?
Sorry, I heard almost all, but the last 15 or 20 minutes we were lined up outside, so we didn't hear
Okay. I was just struck by the conclusion that the original contractual projections hadn't panned out and that R&M suffered for it. What do you think about that? I asked about, okay, you got your income stream, your BAH. The panelists actually said that their projections, their original projections, were not sufficient for various reasons. Some had to do with BAH being reduced and/or stabilized. It wasn't growing at the 2% over time that they projected at the beginning of the contracts. In some cases, there was vacancy because perhaps a greater number of folks chose to live off base. They had issues having to do, and then on the expense side, the operations and administration costs were higher because of unanticipated disasters. I just, and then I listened to really the underlying business requests, which were basically let us get more capital into the projects in order for R&M, I hope, rather than operation, administration, and/or profit. I mean, the whole idea here is sufficient reserve accounts to take care of R&M and not shortchange it. And yet I felt, and then the conclusion that I kept on coming back to was that because the contracts hadn't worked out as projected 10, 20 years later, R&M had suffered for it. Do you feel that?
Sir, I don't see it. No, I don't. But I can't say. There's 79 projects, right, and in a variety of areas spread across the United States. And so, and we've had, it's not just members perhaps choosing to live out in town as opposed to on base. We've also had, in some cases, force structure reduction, so there's less people on that base. And so now, therefore, there's less of a tenant population. And so some of our projects are using what's called the waterfall chart to allow others, DOD civilians and others on a hierarchy, to occupy those houses, to keep the cash flowing in these deals to ensure that we have quality housing. But to answer your question directly, you know, a 50-year deal is tough to project, but I think the pro formas were pretty good, but things have changed. Sometimes on our part, again, if there's been a force structure reduction, or perhaps we're looking to have, say, a capitalization happen on a quicker scale, all right, than maybe the 20 years that perhaps was originally forecast, and we'd like it quicker because it's just what we do these days. So that would change the nature of the deal, and so we'd have to look at them. But I think that our members, our project owners went in with eyes open. This is what they do for a living, and we're trying to hold them to it unless there are extraordinary circumstances. And then, because it is a partnership, frankly, is we need to look at those deals.
Well, you know, I mean, 50 years is a long time to project. But when you get out 50 years in a contract, then you tend to project a little more conservatively because there's more, you know, variables over a longer period of time. And so here's, you know, we can sit here and dwell all the time we can about, you know, what was then and did it work out. And I think it's instructive to ask the question of whether, in fact, the R&M side is not getting sufficient attention because the financial projections are squeezing these companies. However, I think it's probably more constructive to ask the question, okay, what do we do about it? Because the companies came in with some very concrete, you know, business projection-related suggestions, such as changing the deposits, how the deposits are leveraged, long-term debt provisions. Are you engaged in, and by the way, the backdrop to that is I'm also asking myself, well, do we bail them out if that's really what's going on? Is that our responsibility, or was that a risk that they assumed so that it should really come out of their profits, as opposed to, you know, us saying, well, okay, fine, you can create a little bit more of a risky capital infusion strategy than we held them to at the very beginning. So that's the context for my question, but my direct question is, do you feel that we should in fact change some of these requirements to allow them to invest further capital into their companies? And I would assume that would be for the very specific reason of freeing up much more money for a straightforward R&M.
I think on a case-by-case basis, yes. And I think the people sitting behind me are faced with that question and looking at each one of these deals individually to see where it's appropriate and where it's not. And sometimes it's an R&M issue, as you mentioned. Other times it could be something else, like a hurricane or something that devastates the place.
Okay, thank you very much. I should have deferred to you as well.
Thank you. Just very briefly, we did issue a report back in 2018 on MHPI, looking particularly at the financial health of the projects. One of our findings was that while there was a pretty good system in process for looking at the financial health of the projects in the short term, there wasn't necessarily a good system in place for determining their financial viability over the long term. So we made a recommendation to the department that they update their guidance to have a better system in place to do that. I believe that recommendation is still open, so we hope that the department will implement it in short order.
Do I have time for a follow-up, or am I? Okay. A number of those companies said, quote unquote, stabilize the BAH income stream. And I don't know whether that meant, I didn't have a chance to ask them whether that meant increase it or it meant stabilize it. What's your view of what the issue is here? And if so, what is your view of what we should do? And I agree. I mean, it's hard to operate a business enterprise with an inconsistent and unpredictable income stream. That's why you're conservative about it if you're in a 50-year level. But, you know, what should we do to give them a fair, stabilized income stream that they actually can project out with?
So first, I want to acknowledge that we just initiated a new audit looking particularly at the BAH and how it is calculated. We would be happy to brief your staffs on that audit as we proceed with it. I think the issue that a number of people have raised with the BAH is that because of the way it is calculated, even if the percentage of overall rent and utility that it represents goes down, the actual number of BAH, depending on the location, can fluctuate widely. It can go way up, it can go way down. It's not clear sometimes that the BAH really is the appropriate number for the locality that it is designated for. So I think, you know, the first piece of thing that we need to do here is figure out exactly how it is calculated and why. And so that's what we're hoping to get at with our audit.
None of the contracts have a guaranteed minimum currently for BAH. They all float right at whatever the BAH is.
I believe that's correct.
From what I understand is they projected, say, a 2 to 3% increase in BAH over the life of it. I don't, you know, we reduced BAH a few years ago by 5%. And so, but again, I was talking with my hands earlier when I went like this, sorry. It's the fluctuations that I hear the project owners are concerned about, because it's that cash flow that even if it goes up, they're not necessarily happy. You know, economists like to have a nice steady growth. That's what they're looking for too. And when it goes up and then goes down, it's kind of hard to plan.
Well, that's what a reserve account is for. So that's
true. But in the first place, though, why can't it be a little bit more gradual?
Thank you.
As a person who talks with my hands too, I feel your pain. Thank you. Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you mentioned this in your remarks, I'm sorry, because I was in another meeting. But I'd like to ask the 3 omissions out of the Tenant Bill of Rights. Where's OSD on that, and why were they not included?
So, getting back to what this is all about, the access to private capital, all right? Those 3, the Secretary of Defense deemed shouldn't be the subject of unilateral action for us to do it by, you know, using the authority Congress gave us, and just to do it by fiat was to work with the privatization project owners, and that's what we're doing right now. You heard them today, and we'd heard them as well say that they can accept them. We just need to work out the details, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay. So we can expect those 3
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
to be rolled back in at some
Absolutely.
point?
That's right.
Okay. And Ms. Field, when you were talking about the study on the impact of the BAH, you're taking into account the force reduction issues and movements and that kind of thing that was talked about earlier, right?
I think the 2 issues are related, so certainly we will look at how there is an interplay between the BAH calculation and how it fluctuates, as well as circumstances aside from the BAH that could have an impact on the financial health of the program, such as unforeseen events like a severe weather event or a reduction in force.
Okay. Do you see ways that the installation commanders can get more involved, or can you talk a little bit about that? They don't seem to be quite as able or engaged as I think they should be. What's GAO's position on that?
So absolutely, that's a great point. We visited 10 installations as part of our audit, and one of the things that we observed at basically every location was that the military housing offices on the ground were in part understaffed. They all said they were overwhelmed. There were inconsistent oversight practices occurring. For example, only pulling just a very few number of work order records to analyze them, only visiting a few homes in annual compliance visits. I do understand that the military departments have updated their guidance to ensure that commanders on the ground, as well as their military housing offices, are taking steps to strengthen their oversight. One of the recommendations included in our draft report, which again I hope the department will concur with, is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense issue some guidance to the military departments so that it is standardized across the board, and so that it is clear that the expectation from the Office of the Secretary of Defense is that this oversight be strengthened and be sustained over the long term.
Good. And I want to appreciate the work that GAO did on looking at the matrices that these private providers are using, because I think that's part of how we get to this place where things are so bad, because the data that they're looking at tells them things are okay, and it's really not.
Yes, and I think part of the problem here is that the data are not necessarily data that are maintained by the companies. They're also data that are collected and used by OSD. And some of the problems that we found had to do with data collected at that level. We also found problems with the metric, and you alluded to this earlier, problems with the metrics that are contained in the legal agreements that inform the performance incentive fees, which Judge Carter mentioned. There are a lot of problems with those as well. So these are tricky problems that will take some time to be fixed.
But we're working on those now.
I believe the Department of Defense is working on them, yes.
So let me add to that, sir. So yes, to everything you said, the key, and I alluded to this before, is that we can have data to manage this overall, which we absolutely need, and we have to do a better job at it. But also at the local level, at the base level, the installation commanders, as
Right.
you said, that's where, you know, those installation commanders, their housing offices, the units that those members are part of we need to make sure that they are actively engaged in ensuring that our privatization project owners are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Agreed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank both of our witnesses for being here. In particular, thank you to the GAO for jumping on this after the Reuters reports and after we were starting to make noise about it in this subcommittee. It's very, very helpful that the GAO has got involved. I want to, the two subjects I want to cover are the Tenants' Bill of Rights Mr. Rutherford was talking about, and also non-disclosure agreements. First, the Tenants' Bill of Rights. I'm sorry, I didn't fully catch the full discussion, but Mr. Rutherford was asking about three things that were left off the Tenants' Bill of Rights. What were those three things that you were talking about?
The 7-year maintenance history, it was the dispute resolution, and rent withholding.
Okay. Now, those were included in the NDAA language, were they not? And the way you talked about them just now, it sounded like they were optional.
No, I didn't say they were optional. I didn't say they were optional, sir. What I said is the Secretary of Defense felt that they were not subject to unilateral action for us to do it immediately. We're working with partners to arrive at procedures that will allow us to fulfill those three.
Well, okay, let's unpack that a little bit, if you don't mind. When you say we're working with partners, you're talking about a tenant's bill of rights. You're not talking about working with tenants. You're talking about working with the landlords, right?
So, sir, if we...
It's a yes or no question.
Both.
Okay, well, here's the thing. You're talking about how to implement these things with the landlords. And this is not a suggestion. It's not optional in the NDA. It is mandatory on the Department of Defense to start implementing these things.
Yes, sir.
So why would the landlord's opinions or desires or wants have anything to do with that? DOD has been instructed to include these things in the Tenants' Bill of Rights.
Yes, sir, we will. So here's we are doing it. We are working with our privatization partners for a process that will allow them to deliver on the commitment that is in the Tenant Bill of Rights, because if we were to post those right now and include those, we wouldn't have a means to fulfill that promise to our residents.
What's the timeline? What's the timeline?
Well, I don't have one, but I think it's going to be pretty quick.
What's pretty quick for you, sir?
Well, May 1st.
May 1st?
But you're going to hold me to it. Sorry, I'm just going to tell you this. I'm trying like...
That's what we get paid to do, oversight here. All right, let's move over to non-disclosure agreements. The way the NDAA works is that non-disclosure agreements are prohibited at the beginning of a lease. You can't just hand over an NDA and expect the new tenant to sign it. They are allowed if there's litigation and to wrap up litigation, and we've all seen that, and we get that. But where a dispute arises short of litigation, that's kind of a gray area, and I want to get your input on it, Mr. Potochney. Do you see those as allowable?
Only after this suit is filed, as I understand it.
only after the
That's-
suit is
Yeah, I'm
filed.
not a lawyer, but that's what I understand it to be.
So if it came to pass that a tenant who had raised a complaint but had not filed a suit or started a claim, a formal claim, a tenant raised the problem and was presented with an NDA, that would be a violation. Is that correct?
I believe so.
All right. Do you want to weigh in on that, Director Field?
I would
Mr.
just note
Cartwright
that,
has about 1 minute left.
I would just note that when we went to the 10 installations that we visited, we conducted focus groups with residents. The issue of NDAs did come up in a few of them, sometimes second-hand or third-hand, but there was a concern about the potential use of NDAs inappropriately. I do think that the military departments may have issued guidance on the use of NDAs recently, which would be a positive step if I'm correct that that has happened.
Mr. Potochney, would you agree with me that a non-disclosure agreement in general could contribute to delay in addressing housing problems in the private management companies?
I guess in some circumstances, they absolutely could.
Sure. Will you tolerate NDAs being required in non-litigated matters of your service members in the future?
No.
It's a right answer. Let the record reflect the witness said no, and we're satisfied with that. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Before we wrap up, Mr. Rutherford, neither Mr. Rutherford nor Judge Carter have an additional question. Ms. Field, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. A common failing across the services has been indifferent or non-existent command involvement in housing management at the installation level, which Mr. Potochney has acknowledged here today. What is GAO looking at in terms of the recommendations you're making to ensure installation commanders are informed, empowered to act, and motivated to intervene on behalf of military families? Because Colonel Gerber, I think it was Colonel Gerber in our first panel, who talked about how busy the folks in the chain of command are, understandably so, and they don't have a ton of time to be worrying about the nitty-gritty of the housing challenges of their troops. And a private versus a colonel getting the attention of their supervisor, of the person in the chain of command above them and on up the chain, is somewhere between slim and none. So how do we deal with that?
So I think that the tone needs to come from the top, the very top, and that's why one of the recommendations in our draft report is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Potochney's office, issues guidance to the military departments to ensure that their oversight and their expectations for the commanders on the ground is clear and robust. One of the things that we do at GAO routinely is follow up to see if our recommendations are being implemented and if they're being implemented well, and we will certainly do that in this case. I think one other point I want to make is that in the case of the Army, I believe it was 2013, guidance was actually sent out saying that installation commanders should not perform physical inspections of homes. The tone at the top in that case was, this is not your problem, this is not your job. So that is, I think, an important example of why we think strengthened guidance is so important. I should note that that decision has been since reversed.
Oh, thankfully. Okay, good. We haven't talked much about lead today, and I do want to ask you both about lead. There are incoming tenants that are often presented with lead and mold addendums, and the manner in which these issues are presented and discussed prior to move-in is inconsistent across the services. So that leads to confusion and the inability to make an informed decision. Is DOD considering standardizing those lead and mold addendums? Because it makes no sense to deal with them differently across the services.
So I believe so, ma'am. And the reason why I'm saying I believe so is the medical community within the department is doing a lot on making our tracking and the information we're providing people to be consistent across the department. So so the medical piece of it, yes, they are on track.
I'm talking about the addendums themselves.
Well, then what we're looking for then is as well is on something we do control here, and the people behind me is having a uniform lease and consistent policies across.
Because there's not
area.
one now.
No, there isn't, and so we're working on that.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that I brought that out publicly. And is there, given the risk of lead exposure associated with inadequate maintenance on housing built before 1978, is there a plan to phase out those properties or conduct full lead abatement as a more permanent remedy? And is that a recommendation of GAO?
We have not made a recommendation related to phasing out properties, in part because that was outside of the scope of our audit, in part because that would have a financial impact on the projects. The one note I would make about lead, which I think is just as important as the legal addenda, is the issue of how we know where there are issues with lead or mold. And one of the things we wanted to do as part of our audit was figure out what the prevalence was of some of these hazards. What we found is that the data that the partners maintain simply aren't reliable for doing that. So one of the recommendations in our draft report is that the department set some standard expectations for the companies in terms of the data that they maintain.
And is that being done, Mr. Potochney?
I believe so, but I
Do you have a
can't
plan
say-
to phase out the
but
properties or
well,
conduct
not
a
phasing
full
out the
lead
property.
abatement?
So lead abatement procedures are something everybody deals with, and they're subject to state and local provisions as well as federal. So to the extent that lead is present, but it's not a danger, and there's processes and procedures for determining that, I can take that one for the record, what exactly
Okay.
are. You know, we're following those. And but if the lead presents any dangers, yeah, it has to be remediated, absolutely.
Well, we've just heard reports of lead paint being just painted over, and other, pretty horrific descriptions of how lead abatement has been dealt with. And so I don't really get the sense from the feedback that we've been getting and the documentation that's been made by Reuters and others that there is an appropriate lead abatement process in place. And I mean, seems like a more permanent remedy than what is currently being utilized is essential.
So I believe
Lead is
huge,
extremely dangerous.
huge, absolutely, and asbestos as well.
And the damage is irreversible in a human.
That's
Well, the
right.
chair,
That's
that was the question
Yes,
I
I'd
was
be
going to
happy
ask.
to yield.
You got asbestos too, don't you?
Asbestos
I'm
too.
going to bet in the old houses before '77, I think it was, or whatever the year was. So absolutely, I'd rather, if I could, take for the record what we're specifically doing. But I'm going to tell you though is with the exception of some stories like we heard this morning, somebody didn't do their job. So I can't claim we're perfect, but I think we have pretty good processes in place, and I can provide those to you.
Okay, that's not what I don't mean what we heard this morning. I mean, there is pretty
Right.
widespread complaints and concerns about the way lead is being handled and the fact that there are folks moving into homes where they are not adequately notified about the lead that was there. It is discovered while they're there after a lengthy experience, which results in irreversible health damage to their family members. I mean, and it's not an anecdotal thing, it's a well-documented thing. And so if you could answer for the record what your plans are to change the way you approach the lead that is in properties that you currently are responsible for or that have been taken over by privatized housing.
Yes, ma'am. I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Okay, any other members have any questions? Okay. Yeah. With that, I want to thank the witnesses. We have you all have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate your forthright responses, Mr. Potochney. That's refreshing and helpful because we can certainly move forward a lot more easily than if we were really in a tussle this afternoon. So we are only at the beginning of our oversight role here. We plan to, as I said, in all the panels, at the end of all the panels, when we prepare the chairwoman's mark, we fully intend to make sure that we inject some oversight, a lot of which will be from the GAO's recommendations, and we appreciate, Ms. Field, your work and the work of your colleagues, because it helps us be able to make sure that we have an in-tandem operation of oversight and implementation so that we don't just do this and keep spinning our wheels. So with that, the subcommittee is adjourned, subject to the call of the chair, but we will meet tomorrow. Our next hearing is tomorrow at 10:30 in the morning with the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. We stand adjourned.